中国深センにおける事件につきましては、未だ深い悲しみを感じております。亡くなられたお子様に哀悼の誠を捧げるとともに、ご遺族の皆様に改めて心からお悔やみを申し上げます。ご心痛を考えると胸が潰れる思いです。昨日には金杉中国大使を現地に派遣し。
That is Japanese Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa addressing the media after a 10-year-old Japanese student was stabbed to death on his way to school by a man in the southern city of Shenzhen. The tragedy spotlights the complex relationship between Japan and China, and it raises the question of why China up until today is still fueling its nationalism among its people. You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu. Today we continue our conversation with Dr. Orville Schell, American historian who now serves as Arthur Ross Director of the Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations. He is the former dean of the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He has served as China correspondent for multiple news outlets and has witnessed China's rise of nationalism firsthand.
What's so interesting about the question of nationalism in China is that sometimes it's very powerfully there and sometimes it isn't. Now, remember that when Sun Zhongshan wanted to overturn the Manchu dynasty, the Qing dynasty, he was very nationalistic. And he said the problem of China was it didn't have nationalism. He said it was, Ipan Sansha, just scattered and disaggregated. So nationalism, I think, began to come to play, particularly in the Kuomintang period, where Jiang Jieshi was quite nationalistic, the Nationalist Party, and very opposed to the unequal treaties and to the foreign concessions and extraterritoriality, and certainly very angry and indignant at Japanese occupation. So nationalism had a big resurgence. But interestingly, when Deng Xiaoping came around, there was no hint of anti-Americanism. There was very little sense of nationalism. He didn't play the nationalistic card. Nor did Hu Yaobang. Hu Yaobang went to Japan, invited I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of Japanese to come over to China. Neither did Zhao Ziyang. Neither did Jiang Zemin. I went on the trip with Clinton to China to visit Jiang Zemin, and it was quite extraordinary how friendly they were. And they weren't playing the anti-American card, the nationalist card. They were trying to figure out how do we get along. But that has changed. And now we find Xi Jinping, who I take to be a deeply insecure man, using nationalism as a way to sort of pump people up behind him when there are many other challenges and failures that he has to deal with. It's very dangerous. We've seen it in many countries, my own in America. Trump's form of nationalism is very dangerous. Anti-immigrant, anti-foreign, all of our problems are somebody else caused them. We never caused them ourselves. And I think that's very much the playbook now of the leadership in Beijing is problems, someone else caused them.
If China is deliberately fueling its nationalism and blaming everyone else for its own problems, should other countries still engage with it?
Well, I think engagement, if it can work, is clearly the best approach. But there's one critical element that engagement actively requires, and that is cooperation and reciprocity. You cannot have engagement if only one side wants to engage. And the other side is saying, oh, we'd like to win-win and get along and be friendly, but we have this red line, that red line, the other red line. We want Taiwan. We want the South China Sea. We want to do this, that, and we're not going to talk about it. You can't have, it's like a marriage. one partner can't always be right. You have to work it out. And I think we are now at a place in China where it's not possible to have engagement because we do not have the necessary will that creates reciprocity, flexibility, openness, and are willing to solve a problem by each side making a few concessions and having the fundamental urge to get along.
On Tuesday, September 24th, the U.S. ambassador to UN Human Rights Council called on China to implement recommendations made by the UN Human Rights Office to release Uyghurs and others unjustly detained in Xinjiang.
Mr. President, I read this statement on behalf of the core group of countries that 2 years ago asked this council to hold a debate on the situation of human rights in Xinjiang, following the publication of the assessment by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That assessment found that the, quote, extent of arbitrary and discriminatory detention of members of Uyghur and other predominantly Muslim groups may constitute international crimes, in particular, crimes against humanity, end quote. Relying extensively on China's own records, the assessment further documented systematic use of invasive surveillance on the basis of religion and ethnicity, severe and undue restrictions on cultural, religious, and linguistic identity and expression, torture, and sexual and gender-based violence, including forced abortion and sterilization, enforced disappearances and family separations, and forced labor. Over the past 2 years, China has had many opportunities to meaningfully address these well-founded concerns. We regret that China has denied the impartial and objective findings and rejected the recommendations of the OHCHR's assessment.
That is American diplomat Michelle Taylor demanding that China clarify the fate and the whereabouts of missing family members and facilitate safe contact and reunion during a speech at the current Human Rights Council session in Geneva. In 2018, the UN Working Group on Enforced and Involuntary Disappearances reported a dramatic increase in cases from Xinjiang with the introduction of re-education camps in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region by the government of China. Numerous research and investigative reports published since that time by a diverse range of non-governmental organizations, think tanks, media outlets, as well as public accounts by victims, have alleged arbitrary detention on a broad scale in the so-called camps, as well as claims of torture and other ill treatment, including sexual violence and forced labor, among others. Will other countries be able to stop China from continuing to commit all these human rights abuses?
I think it's very difficult for outsiders to change things within China, except by setting a good example, and except by being successfully democratic and open ourselves. And we don't always do that so well. I think it's very difficult. I mean, and Americans have done a lot of this to think we can go in and fix things everywhere. We haven't been very successful. I think the media is very important here to keep information flows open and truthful. And this is one thing the Communist Party does not like. It does not want foreign reporters in China. It does not want its people to listen to this program and other programs because it makes them perhaps less governable by a one-party state. So I think we do have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that we are the ones responsible and that we can make a difference. We can make a small difference, and I think we have to be there at the right times. But finally, it's going to be up to the Chinese people to decide what happens.
Right after Michelle Taylor's speech, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, and multiple countries' foreign ministers on the sidelines of UN General Assembly in New York that the political manipulation of human rights issues by a few countries such as the United States is becoming increasingly unpopular across the world. Interestingly, Wang said China is willing to engage in dialogue with all countries on human rights issues, on the basis of equality. Yet it just announced that it is investigating the company that owns US fashion brands Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein for suspected discriminatory measures against Xinjiang cotton companies. The United States banned imports from Xinjiang in 2021, citing the concerns of human rights violations and forced labor. And now Beijing is fighting back, accusing the firm of boycotting Xinjiang cotton and other products without any factual basis.
China's strategy is the following. China wants to be independent and not reliant on supply chains outside of its country. This is like Mao Zedong's 自力更生, self-reliance. However, they want to create as much dependencies so that foreign countries are dependent on China, because they can use that as pressure and a lever to force people to obey. So this is where the global market system gets very complicated, because if you have a global market system, you are going to be dependent on other countries. So I think what we're learning now is in a globalization, it's fine to have global markets, but that the form of governments, the political nature of governments, like in China, actually matter. And you do not want to become overly dependent on a government which will punish you when you do something they don't like. That's not the way a global market can function, because then the other side will respond and punish, and you get into this competition of tariffs and punitive actions, which is where we are now. And Taiwan's stuck right in the middle of it because TSMC and microchips, and which the world depends on, and nobody quite knows what the best way to deal with that problem will be.
In late August, a trial went underway in Oakland, California to decide the ownership of diaries written by a former secretary to Communist China's founder Mao Zedong, Li Rui, who became a vocal critic of the Chinese Communist Party.
So Li Rui was a person who worked in high circles during earlier times, during the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and at one point was even secretary to Mao Zedong. And he kept very careful records. And when he died, he did not want to leave a will, because that would have left a record that he felt, I think, could be distorted. But he evidently told his daughter that he would like to have the records taken outside of China, which she did. And she put them at Stanford University in the Hoover Archive. However, his wife, who is 90, is still in China. And the party is sort of using her to say that she owns the documents, not the daughter. And they filed some lawsuits in China. And of course, in China, they won. Now they're filing a lawsuit in California to take back the documents, because the Communist Party does not like to have sort of things like this leak out. But even if they win, which I think is unlikely, but if they do win, they get the documents. Stanford still has copies, so scholars can still use them. And it's quite an amazing record of the Chinese Communist Revolution through the eyes of somebody who was sitting right up high in the ranks of the party. But I think his apartment was in Buxidi on Chang'anjie, going into Tiananmen Square, which was the main route down which the People's Liberation Army came on June 4th. And there was not really a massacre in Tiananmen Square. There was a massacre further down, actually took place, I think, very near Li Rui's apartment, and he got to watch the troops firing on people, and so that was a kind of a very brutalizing experience, I think, for him and the people who lived there. But those apartment buildings in that part of the city were given to a lot of military figures and high-ranking officials. It was a sort of a place a place for the elite to live.
Li's widow, who's fighting with Stanford for the diaries, says that the materials reflect deeply personal fears, including intimate correspondence.
I think there probably are some personal things there, but you have to imagine a 90-year-old woman is going to go to court. It's a little bit unbelievable. And we do know how the party works. They tell people what to do, and then they do it. And I think they are using her to make a point that if other Chinese start shipping their documents overseas, there'll be penalties. This is a very punitive government and a very punitive society, and it imposes costs on people who transgress it. And this is one of the problems, I should say, with journalists, that the one way they've controlled journalists for years is to threaten or actually deny visas. And if you can't get a visa to cover the subject that you've spent your life learning how to cover, you in effect have your legs chopped off. So the effect is powerful, just like companies. Once they have a factory in China, once they have a supply chain in China, it's very hard for them to imagine cutting that off because the losses are so great.
And back to Taiwan. In late August, there was a trend among Taiwanese influencers to travel to China, specifically Xinjiang, and film tours and videos that paint a perfect picture of Xinjiang being a beautiful location for tourists to visit.
Well, I think there are some people, whether from Taiwan or Europe or America, who do speak Chinese, and most of these people do, that maybe they do support China. But there are other people who are getting paid to do this, and it's quite lucrative. This is sort of traditional forms of Chinese propaganda. What's new about it is that 10, 20, 30 years ago, propaganda was largely aimed at guanais, inside the country. But now that China is more wealthy and more powerful, it is starting to do what Xi Jinping has said, to tell China's story better abroad. 说好中国的故事. So these bloggers are part of that effort now, which is much grander, much larger, much more global, to also control information flows abroad. And it's not surprising. This is the way it works. It's just become global.
It was such a treat for me to listen to Mr. Orville Schell's account and his analysis of China's modern history. And after writing 15 non-fiction books about China, Mr. Schell has decided to branch out. My Old Home, a novel of exile.
Well, after all these years writing scholarly papers, journalism, long-form articles, books of nonfiction, I thought that they had a difficult time explaining everything. There were other aspects of human life, human motivation, that needed to be explored. But it's very hard to do that in nonfiction. So I set out to write this novel. It took me 35 years. And I wanted to explore things like religion, people's personal relations, culture, things like music. In other words, there was a famous Chinese writer, Liu Bingyan, who wrote a book called Second Kind of Loyalty. The Chinese Communist Party demands loyalty, but there are other kinds of loyalty in life. Loyalty to your children, to your wife, to your friends, to principles, to morals, that are best expressed through things like music and literature. So I thought, let's take a musician, one who is religious, loves the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, plays the piano, and lives in here, not out there in the world where Mao Zedong wants to make a revolution, who believes that, you should first start to fix yourself before you start having class warfare. And I'd throw him into China in 1950, innocently, naively, but with a certain goodness of heart, went back to China to build a new country and ended up in a nightmare. So I wanted to explore that. And then he has a son who's also a musician who, of course, gets tangled up in the Cultural Revolution, ends up in Qinghai for years, living in this terribly remote, strange little place, and then finally His father dies and he decides he wants to go to America, where his father had studied.
Thank you for listening. This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.